All right, we're joined now by independent journalist Lee Fang. His Substack is excellent. You can subscribe at leefang.com. Absolutely one of my favorites. This week, Lee took a deep dive into Kamala Harris's record. Actually, for us here at Unheard, we're going to talk a lot more about Harris's background now. Lee, first of all, thank you so much for being our first guest on Undercurrents.
This is a huge honor. Unheard is very lucky to have you, and I'm lucky to be here. So good to join you.
Well, I really appreciate it. And you know California politics so well, which kind of means you know Kamala Harris very well because she really is a figment of the California Democrat mold. Can you tell us how California, or what California, tells us about Kamala Harris? How is she sort of a creature of California politics?
Well, San Francisco looms large, not just in California politics, but in American politics overall. I mean, this is the city that produced the most powerful Democratic speaker of the modern era, Nancy Pelosi, arguably one of the most powerful Democratic leaders overall, the last generation, that's produced Gavin Newsom, the current governor, and of course Kamala Harris, who came up in the same kind of power elite within San Francisco as Gavin Newsom. She's ascended rapidly up the political ladder. And it's worth looking at the actual faction of San Francisco politics that produced these types of leaders, particularly Harris and Newsom. You know, the kind of stereotype as San Francisco as this leftist hotbed of, you know, liberalism gone wild that's led to homelessness and, you know, open air drug markets and unaffordable apartments. You know, there's some truth to that. It's a complicated story, but I think this image does not reflect fully on who these politicians are. You know, within the context of San Francisco politics, Newsom and Harris represent the more moderate, pro-business, centrist wing of the party, and that's kind of hard to imagine given the kind of liberal image that they have. But it's just true. You know, back in 2003. When Gavin Newsom was battling the very powerful, at the time, Green Party of San Francisco. At that time, there was actually a former communist district attorney, Terrence Hallinan, who was hated by the kind of upper crust elite of the city and you know, many working class people as well, for being too soft on crime, for being too lenient on criminals. And Kamala Harris was recruited kind of by the billionaires and the upper crust of the city to run against Terrence Hallinan, and she ran on a tough on crime platform, you know, saying that she was going to get tough on anti-war protesters, on violent criminals, on gangs. She used electioneering that was very aggressive, you know, sending pictures of gang members and chalk lines of homicide victims, saying, you know, you're not safe with Terrence Hallinan in office. And like Gavin Newsom, she shares a similar kind of pool of talent. You know, the same operatives, the same donors have fueled both of their rises. And in many ways, they share similar political tactics. Gavin Newsom, as he ran for governor, was very savvy in channeling conservative culture war and kind of injecting himself into the conversation. He ran what appeared to be pro-Trump ads within California to kind of select his political opponent, to kind of get conservatives excited for the weakest possible Republican nominee. At the same time, he excited the liberal base with all kinds of promises about big progressive reforms, you know, a Marshall Plan for housing, single-payer healthcare, you know, promising the moon to the leftists. At the end of the day, he steamrolled through his Republican opposition that he helped hand select by manipulating the Republican primary, and then did basically nothing on any of the big progressive promises for, you know, when he was running for office. Now, Kamala Harris might be kind of similar here. You know, she's had the same kind of campaign managers, the same consultants as Gavin Newsom, and you know, the Republicans, Donald Trump is now they're kind of highlighting all the leftist promises she made back in 2019 when she was running for president. You know, she was talking about Medicare for all, Green New Deal. She even kind of gestured towards abolishing ICE. Well, I would say look at her 20-year career. She's more of a moderate in terms of governance. She's much more pro-business. She has family and professional connections very thoroughly tied to Silicon Valley and major tech companies.
Lee, you dived into that. Could you flesh a little bit out what those connections are? Because particularly, it seems her brother-in-law, who was married to her campaign chair, her sister, was her campaign chair in 2019. It seems to me those immediate familial connections are extremely relevant.
Yeah, that's right. When she ran for president, her campaign was run by Bear Star Strategies, this consulting firm that's long advised the tech industry, including the gig companies, and also by her sister Maya, whose brother is Tony West, the former Obama justice official, who is now the chief legal officer of Uber. And that title, chief legal officer, sounds fairly bland, but really he is a political powerhouse, someone who's helped engineer these major political victories that have given Uber so much market share. That's brought it to profitability. California, one of its largest markets, attempted to give drivers the ability to join a union, to receive minimum wage, to kind of receive other benefits that traditional employees use. And he helped change the California Constitution in a major ballot measure, one of the most expensive political corporate campaigns we've seen in California history, to revoke all of those rights and to basically give Uber everything it wanted and encode Uber's kind of legal demands into the California Constitution. So Kamala's brother-in-law and her campaign consultants were going to war essentially with organized labor, with drivers of rideshare companies. That's her inner circle. That's not just her family, but those are the people advising her campaign.
As you're saying this, I'm starting to think maybe the definitive Kamala Harris moment is that time in the debate. I forget which debate exactly it was, but they were asking about Medicare for all. Kamala Harris raised her hand and said that she was in favor of Medicare for all, and then clarified a couple of days later, maybe even later that night, said she had heard the question wrong. And actually, she was in favor of a different kind of half solution that wasn't quite Medicare for all, something to that extent. Because this is like a fascinating dichotomy between someone who's close to efforts to actually undermine organized labor, but is also flirting with abolishing ICE. And is like, it just seems that there's a totally different campaign messaging strategy. It's like the packaging is one thing and the actual product itself is totally different. So it's sort of like a magic trick that she's trying to pull on the public.
Well, this magic trick, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head. This is classic California style. The kind of Democratic power elite promising really big reforms, gesturing and embracing the iconography of civil rights, or doing symbols of activism and kind of draping themselves under various flags that posture as radical. But in terms of governance, they're fairly pro-business. They're pro-status quo. You know who else promised single payer, who campaigned on single payer? Nancy Pelosi, before she became speaker. She talked about single payer quite a bit throughout the 90s. But then once she ascended to power, where she would have the position to actually enact any of these, or attempt to enact any of these changes, poof, it's gone. So Nancy Pelosi, Kamala Harris, and Gavin Newsom, three Democratic politicians who have talked endlessly about these big progressive wish list items like single payer, but then once in office, nothing happens.
But it's almost like on some of these culture issues. I'm thinking of Gavin Newsom in particular, and I imagine there's something to work with on Kamala Harris here as well, that they just sort of saw culture stuff as almost inconsequential and worth the political posturing. Whatever happened with drugs and homelessness under Gavin Newsom's watch, he really did give that sort of olive branch to the actual left. Not just the corporate left, but on some of those issues, he really has in the past. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Lee. And it reminds me of Matt Stoller, who's a huge sort of proponent of antitrust reform. He said when he was following Kamala Harris's early career, he was sort of hopeful about her ascendancy, that she was saying some stuff that really sounded right and had done some stuff that actually was right. So what can we make of what she actually says and what she actually does? What California politicians like Harris and Newsom, Pelosi as well, say? And then it does seem like sometimes they actually do give a little bit to the left, and I'm wondering what you think Harris might do on that front.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that any of these politicians are completely, they're empty suits, they do nothing. Gavin Newsom has accomplished some interesting things, working on sectoral bargaining to give fast food workers more rights. I think that's very interesting. Not many Democratic governors have done that outside of Tim Walz in Minnesota, for those types of pro-labor reforms that kind of work around labor unions. Kamala Harris, as Attorney General, did crack down on really predatory for-profit colleges that were exploiting the kind of student loan program to prey on people and saddle them with debt with really substandard education. And, I think those, should credit where it's due. But, one investigation that I had last month, before the kind of craziness of the last 2 weeks, looked at Kamala Harris's there's a standard line she's given dozens of times in speeches at the White House and on the campaign trail about how, she's always been concerned with racial disparities. And as prosecutor in San Francisco, she created the first or one of the first environmental justice units that would prosecute corporate criminals, polluters who are dumping hazardous waste in racial minority neighborhoods, saying that that's a form of racism. That, and she was very early to this. This is now like a very popular slogan and, marker within the progressive movement. But she was doing this back in 2004, 2005. She was an early adopter. So it's great rhetoric. It's actually very savvy in terms of knowing where understand the direction of the progressive movement and the Democratic Party. But here's the rub. I looked at the actual record of her environmental justice unit, and this was supposedly focused on protecting the community of Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco, which is predominantly African American, that is very polluted. It's a former industrial site, has radioactive waste, has asbestos, and many other problems. Her environmental justice unit didn't prosecute a single polluter that was dumping in Bayview's Hunter Point. They went after a small newspaper, that a single smog check auto body repair shop that was not even in Hunter's Point. All the big industrial polluters were left untouched, but it's a great applause line. It's something that she's used for 20 years in her campaign videos on the stump. It sounds great, it perfectly works into the ethos of the Democratic Party. But, again, not that much tough action in terms of holding powerful institutions or corporations accountable.
It kind of reminds me of some of the arguments we've heard against Kamala Harris about her One West settlement. Steve Mnuchin in the aftermath of the Great Recession. Is that sort of a similar thing that she's actually talked about that on the campaign trail too?
This has been an issue with a lot of powerful Democratic politicians where, they talk tough on the financial crisis, on the foreclosure crisis. Kamala Harris did kind of lead the settlement process around fraudulent foreclosures. But, there's a lot of critics out there that say that she didn't do enough. She kind of, like the Obama administration at the time, refused to go after these banks in a criminal way. She didn't press criminal charges on One West or many other fraudulent banks or, exploitative banks in California. Her settlement process, it promised a lot of money to homeowners and victims. But at the end of the day, the money kind of went to a lot of states to plug budget deficits and kind of went to like the NGO complex where, God knows how that money's actually spent. To me, it's not a very impressive accomplishment. There's not much there. But it also kind of, it gets back to this point we started on. This is not something that necessarily a lot of Democratic voters, especially the kind of upwardly mobile college-educated ones, necessarily want to hear about. The culture war about, fighting white supremacy or Donald Trump's threat to democracy and these kind of existential cultural issues dominate. So are we going to talk about, her record with the banks or with polluters and others, or are we going to kind of veer into this kind of culture war? And, you look at her peer group in San Francisco of Gavin Newsom, and he was very savvy in baiting Republicans into culture war issues that benefited him. Now, again, the context is different. This is California, not the whole country. Perhaps the culture war will not benefit Kamala in the same way that it benefited Gavin Newsom in California. But it's it's a powerful distraction from these kind of meat and potato economic issues.
So yeah, actually on that note, I was fascinated. I don't know if it's like wrong that I was surprised by this, but she put out a statement denouncing the demonstrators by Union Station just last night who were burning American flags and replacing the American flag with the Palestinian flags. The reason I was surprised, I mean, I wasn't surprised that she denounced, these demonstrators. I was surprised that she said anything at all, let alone her campaign cobbling together a public statement and sort of going on offense and like staking out a position here. Were you surprised by that, or what does that tell us maybe about how Kamala Harris will handle, you actually mentioned yourself the iconography of the civil rights movement being really powerful in California Democratic circles. She's certainly used that herself many times, especially as she tried to beat Joe Biden in the primary. What have you seen from her so far that might give us an indication of how she's campaigning and how she'll govern on those culture war kind of questions?
It's hard to say. I'm reminded from that statement about the protesters, about what she did in San Francisco in her first race. There were anti-Iraq war protesters who were taking it to a similar extreme, who were, setting things on fire and rioting in the streets of San Francisco. She was very quick to come out and condemn those protesters, realizing that, maybe the cause is popular, but those tactics are not. She's a savvy politician. She realizes that burning the American flag is not winning over any hearts and minds of persuadable voters. She knows what she's doing. But this kind of gets me back again to just kind of this issue of personnel as policy. It's hard to trust what any politician says on the campaign trail. They will say anything based on what they think will win people over to their side. The fact that she's staffing up with Eric Holder, Obama's former attorney general, who's been a corporate attorney, that many of her strategists and advisors come from the corporate lobbying world, that's just to me that it's very likely that she's going to campaign on and uphold much of the Biden administration agenda. But if anything, she's going to be more of a pro-business, pro-Silicon Valley version of Biden, if anything, if there's going to be any change at all.
Super interesting. She, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe her parents were involved in the sort of revolutionary post-war left. Is there anything there? She's talked about before going to protests as a child. Actually, she talks about it pretty frequently. California has obviously long been a hub of the revolutionary left. Did she maintain any ties early in her career to some of those groups? What does that history look like when it comes to Harris?
No, she didn't. There's a long kind of history of Marxist or leftist professors having children who, run for office. Pete Buttigieg's father was kind of a communist academic. Ed Miliband in the UK, had a very leftist academic father. Ed Miliband, centrist labor. Pete Buttigieg is definitely not a communist, McKinsey consultant rather, and Kamala Harris is the same. She had endless opportunities working in and growing up in the Bay Area to join or kind of dabble in the radical left. Look through her history. It's not there. She worked as a prosecutor in Alameda County, that's kind of Oakland, East Bay. Then she worked at the city attorney's office in San Francisco. And she had very close ties with the donor elite from very early on in her career, and they're the ones that helped her run for her first campaign as a get tough on crime, kind of centrist district attorney. That's the first 30, 40 years of her career. I think that tells us more than, a little bit of pandering in 2019 when she was running for the Democratic primary.
Just a little bit. I'm actually not asking this in a salacious way. I mean this sort of professionally. Her relationship with Jerry Brown is the subject of a lot of scuttlebutt, but just professionally, they're obviously very close. I think they were openly dating at one point. Does that tell us anything about who Kamala Harris is, what she might
Willie
be?
Brown. Yeah.
Oh, Willie Brown. I'm sorry. That's right. It was Willie Brown. There's so many Browns in San Francisco areas.
Yeah, a lot of Browns in California. Yeah, I mean, it's controversial, and I see the kind of sensitivity around this issue. There's kind of a smear that women can only get ahead with sleeping with people or through their looks, and I'm sensitive to that too. I don't want to have I want to be fair to anyone I cover here, but it is fair grounds to at least talk about this relationship that Willie Brown, this incredibly powerful California politician who was previously Speaker of the House, who went on to become San Francisco mayor. Even after leaving office, and he's very old now, he's still kind of a wheeler and dealer, very much central to the San Francisco elite, a corporate consultant who's advised business interests throughout California. When early in Kamala's history, when she was kind of a nobody, when she was a young attorney, she started dating Willie Brown. He appointed her to several state boards that paid her, $100,000 a year, without many official job duties. I believe he also gave her a BMW. He reportedly opened a lot of political doors for her. It was a very advantageous relationship. It was short-lived, I believe, only a few years. But again, this kind of reminds voters that she's not a radical. I mean, Willie Brown is far from a leftist. He's definitely part of the centrist conservative faction of San Francisco politics that birthed not just Kamala, but also Gavin Newsom and others.
Yeah, basically what I'm getting from this is it's impossible to know what Kamala Harris actually believes. Like, I really am coming away from this with no idea.
Yeah, I think she's struggled with this, right? Like, she goes through this whole Democratic primary process. She's been vice president. What is she actually known for? Does she have a signature accomplishment? Is she remembered for any trademark policy of the Biden administration? I mean, she's vaguely tied to the border and national security and abortion rights, I suppose. But I don't think any average person, especially not, a political nerd like you or I, can tie Kamala to anything, So this is the challenge for Kamala Harris. She's really the one area where she has the most accomplishments, she's unfortunately disavowed. She was getting tough on undocumented immigrants in San Francisco, getting tough on child truancy, getting tough on gangs. But because of the, whatever you want to call it, the woke wars or the Trump era leftism of 2018, 2019 Democratic Party, she disavowed her old record. But really, that's kind of her most substantive, meaty record, where she actually produced a lot of results, and that was for a considerable chunk of her life in public office. So what does that leave her with? She didn't pass a lot of bills in the Senate. It's not clear what she will run on this year. In some ways, she's a blank slate.
Yeah, and she doesn't have to get through a primary this time around, and there's been a bit of a vibe shift since 2019, 2020 on those issues. So we'll see how she handles her record as a prosecutor going forward. Lee, a couple of just quick, maybe more personal questions. You, again, have covered California politics for a long time. What was it like to report out the Twitter files in the context of being somebody who's so familiar with San Francisco? It seems to me that Twitter was very much, and as you were looking at this, I mean, the left's relationship with the intelligence community, especially in California, is the subject of books like Chaos and all kinds of investigations over the years. For you, what was it like to cover that from the Twitter files with so much access? I mean, it had to have been kind of overwhelming as you were, and daunting as you had all the potential of getting through documents ahead of you.
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts there, but the top line is that it was weird. I've worked with lots of different sources for inside information. Doing formal record requests, kind of getting them through courthouses, meeting whistleblowers in parking lots and through encrypted services. It's very rare. It's never happened before that, the source is this eccentric billionaire that's inviting journalists in to just kind of rifle through the files. It's kind of like, you feel like a bank robber, but really the bank CEO is inviting you in to go.
And he's a defense contractor, right? Yeah, there's just so much going on there.
Yeah, and it's like, I only had a very small window to look at the documents. It was only 2 or 3 days, or maybe 4 days, and I had a limited number of searches. I was also helping the other journalists there, Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, with some of their searches. So it was kind of a whirlwind, but it's just incredible. Out of the few searches that I was able to make, I mean, I produced, something like a dozen stories looking at Saudi intelligence officers spying at Twitter, at the FBI and Department of Homeland Security censoring various forms of speech, including even a New York Times journalist, looking at the pharmaceutical industry and how they kind of worked with an NGO and were sending lists of Twitter accounts to censor to Twitter. under the rubric of saying, hey, we've got to we have to get serious about the pandemic and stop misinformation, disinformation. It was very eye-opening. My only regret is that I did not push harder to stay longer and get more information, because I don't know if I'll ever have an opportunity like that again.
Well, don't beat yourself up. I can't imagine what it was like to have that task. Lee, thank you so much. It was fantastic to have you here. I really appreciate it.
I'm so glad that Unheard has you, Emily, your incredible voice, and thanks again for having me.
You're too kind. We'll be right back after this. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe to the Undercurrents channel, and I'll see you back here soon.